So my previous video was on pfSense Community Edition and getting it running with 2 NICs in Azure, and it used, if we have a look at the description here, it used PowerShell. And this video I'm going to do is just on using the Azure Portal to do everything instead of PowerShell. But the first video, if you follow the steps to get a virtual hard drive created in Hyper-V and get to the point where you've configured pfSense in Hyper-V locally to run in Azure, then you can upload the VHD and you'll be ready to start this video using purely the Azure Portal. So what we've got, and we can have a look at an image to sort of visualize it, we're going to upload a VHD into a storage account. We're going to change that VHD into a managed disk. Then we're going to create a virtual machine based on that managed disk with the addition of all of the components we need. We've also got a test VM running in a backend subnet. So there's 2 subnets. The WAN interface will be in a front-end subnet and the LAN interface will be in the back-end subnet, and you'll be serving all the clients through that back-end NIC. So this will go through just the process of getting it all running with the challenges along the way. So looking at our storage account, as I mentioned, we have a virtual hard drive, a VHD, and this is the one we're going to use. So we don't need to do anything from here, but we need to go into disks to start with and use the create button to and let's just be really explicit. Right, so the source for the disk is the storage blob, so we're going to import it from our store here. And this is vital. If you select OS type as none, it will not boot and you won't be able to create a VM from it. So make sure you select Linux. Even though it's a free BSD image, it needs to be Linux. Standard security type, it's Gen 1, and then finally we need to change the disk size, and this is the size of the disk I created in Hyper-V. It was just 16 gigabytes, and I've just set it to the same. If you want to create a different VM size, probably best just to use these increments so that you can not have to create a custom disk size. Finally, just step through. In the networking tab, nothing changes. Just keep going, review and create. And it'll take a few moments to deploy. Once that's done, you can go to that resource and you'll see that if you've done it correctly and selected OS type as Linux, you'll have a create VM option here. So click on that button. Again, you can leave the defaults and just give the virtual machine a descriptive name. And go next. And I don't want to save that password. Next, now in networking we want to put the WAN interface, so the first interface will by default be the WAN interface, so we want to put that into the front end network so that it's in the right spot. Next we say we want a basic security group. That's good. I'll just go back, I'll double check everything at the bottom here. Okay, and boot diagnostics, leave that configured. It's good to be able to see a screenshot of where your VM is in the boot process. And then hit create, and finally just wait for it to deploy. And once it's deployed, we can click the Go to Resource button. Now, as we mentioned, enabling boot diagnostics allows you to see screenshots. When you first start your VM, it won't be available because it hasn't had time to take a snapshot and place it into a storage account. But within a few minutes, you'll probably see a screenshot appear here as it goes into its boot cycle. But because this image, if we have a look at our previous video, if you look at this step, make changes to get it ready to run, what we did was we enabled this image for the serial console. So if we click on serial console, the machine's had a moment to boot. We can see that it takes a few moments, but once it connects, we can actually see that the machine, you have the console access here, which is really, really good. So you'll be able to interact with it, and you can see that it's still booting, and now it's saying boot up complete, and now we should see in the console the menu that you'd normally see in pfSense. So it's now, the machine's now up, so we'd now like to try and get connected to it. Now, in order to get connected to it, the default port that needs to be open is the HTTPS port, and currently this default Network Security Group does not have that. So what we'll do is create a rule to allow HTTPS. Now, if you wanted to restrict that, you could obviously make it to your specific IP address if you want to limit admin access, and you'd do that normally, only allow trusted hosts, but in this particular case we're just going to leave it open to the world. And once we've got that Network Security Group rule added, we can then go and copy our public IP address and get our browser up and press enter. Now this will take a little moment for it, the Network Security Group rule to deploy and to connect. So still hasn't come to the party yet, but it will take a few moments, and then we'll see that it's your connection is not private. Now that's because pfSense deploys with an untrusted certificate. That's okay. We just say proceed. Now I'm going to attempt to log in, and this is pretty much what's going to happen with the default instance of pfSense. It's saying a HTTP referrer was detected other than what's defined. So what it's saying is it's saying using an IP address, it's just rejecting it. Now how do we get around this? Well, one way to do it is to, because you won't be able to log in because it'll keep rejecting you, is to, we need to open Notepad, or we need to go to the host file. So I'm going to open Notepad as an administrator, and then I'm going to open, the path is C Windows driver system, C Windows System 32 drivers, etc. And we're just going to open the host file. And so I've already done this in another run through, so I'm just going to copy the IP address here and paste it into our host file. to give myself a host name of pfSense.home.arpa. Now that's the default host name and domain for this pfSense installation. So as soon as we do that and we try again to enter our password, it shows up that I've actually forgotten the password for my pfSense installation. Now, if you've configured it in your local Hyper-V environment and you know the password, well, that'll be fine. You'll be able to enter it because it's already set. But in this case, I've forgotten what I set it to. So I'm going to go into the serial console again. And the serial console will only be available if you've enabled it. So have a look at my previous video on how to get that enabled as you install it in your local Hyper-V environment. And here we've got the serial console. Just press enter to get rid of the rubbish, and then we just use the number 3 option to reset the password there, and it resets back to pfSense, which is the default password. And then we can go admin pfSense, and we're now in our pfSense environment. So how do we now get away from this challenge of being, connecting to this host? We don't want to be modifying our host file all the time. Well, let's give our pfSense firewall a host and domain name on the internet. So we can do that by going into our network interface, going to our IP configurations, and I think we're going to have to go, actually we're in the wrong spot, so we want to go into, we're in the wrong spot. We'll need to go into, let's just go public IP addresses, and we'll go into the public IP address for our pfSense firewall. Now to find that from the VM side of things, obviously go into your pfSense firewall, and you can actually just click on the public IP address and it jumps straight to it. I just wasn't thinking. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give this particular host a unique host name, and then click save. And once I've clicked save on that, it will take a few moments, then it's done and it's live. Go back into our VM and it'll have a host name available here. So I'll just click on copy, and we'll just go into our pfSense. Now just before we make this change, we want to obviously change our pfSense firewall from the default password, because that's a massive security hole to start with. And just have a look at the settings that we're getting around here. So if we scroll down on the System Advanced, if we scroll down, we can see there's 2 things that are going to be causing issues. There's disable DNS rebinding checks and disable HTTP refer enforcement check. So both of these, if they're checked, are making it less secure. So we don't necessarily want to bypass these, but we configure our system so that they don't cause an issue. So we've now got an internet domain name, and we can just put that in. And we could obviously create our own DNS entry and point it at the IP address of the pfSense if we wanted to. Now, what happens when we try to access it using our old, and you notice here that we've now got a potential DNS rebind attack. So those 2 settings will stop us accessing our firewall unless we get it right. So I'll just go back and copy that full and put it in, and now we can see that if we've got the right host name and we're accessing it correctly, we're okay and we can just log in. Now clearly, if you do want to access this by IP address as well, you want to do this. So save that and exit, and then you'll be able to access without getting the HTTP referrer error, and it'd be okay just to access it by IP address, so you'll have no issues there making that setting under System Advanced. Now at the moment we've got just a WAN interface, and it's currently, if we have a look at the interfaces, it's currently being handed out by DHCP. That's fine, but we can make some changes just to make sure that interface IP address will never change. And we can do that by going into our interface, go into IP configurations, go into IP config, and we'll just say set it to static and set it to the same IP address it's currently got, but that just means that it will never vary from that. Now, what more do we need to do in order to add a second interface? Well, we need to go into network. Well, before we do that, we'll actually shut this machine down. So we'll just now stop our virtual machine. Now, if we do this and we add a IP address, if I stop it now, there's going to be a problem with access. So this is a vitally important thing we need to do. We need to go into our firewall, and you notice here there's an anti-lockout rule underneath the WAN interface. As soon as we add a LAN interface to the configuration, this lockout rule will move to the LAN interface to allow access only from the LAN interface, and then it will remove it here and we'll lose access. And of course we're talking to this over the internet from the public side, the WAN side, so we need to put in a anti-lockout rule for ourselves. This one can be sourced for any. Normally you would say, okay, just set it to not allow access from my specific host to make it more secure, but we're just going to say any, and then we say, okay, I want to be able to access this firewall from the WAN address to the by connecting to the WAN address. So that's now our own personal anti-lockout rule. We want to hit apply to make sure that sticks, and now we can go and turn the machine off. Now you can halt the system by going to diagnostics halt system, but that will shut the machine down. But what we need to do is not just shut it down, but we also need to deallocate it. So we go into our virtual machine in Azure and click stop, and you can see now it's deallocating, and it will now enable us to add a network interface. So we'll just go to network interfaces, and we're going to create our own LAN interface now. So we'll just call that backend, so it's going into the NIC, and it needs to go into the backend subnet. So there it is, and we can give it a static IP as well, because that will become the gateway address for all the host behind it, and it won't actually be specified, but we'll have to put a route table to tell all the hosts in the backend subnet to connect to use this to route to the internet. So that's important to remember that address. So let's review and create, and once we've created it, we can just wait for it to deploy, which it's done. And then we can go into our virtual machine, so our pfSense virtual machine, and we want to go into our network settings and choose the attach a network interface option. So we see it's available there, so we just go OK, and we wait for it to attach. Now, when we first attach an interface, you just have to wait for that to finish, and it's done. When we first attach an interface and it's fresh, we haven't added a network security group, but we can add a security group just to give ourselves that default firewalling, and that's just the default, so we're going to leave that the way it is. And now we've got a fully 2-nicked VM, and we just need to click refresh so that we can get the start button back, and we want to go from stopped to running. So now we just click on start and allow it to boot up. Now that's going to take a few minutes to boot up. If we have a look now in our screenshots, we can see that we've got an image of the boot up going on, or that was the shutdown, so it's a little bit old, but again, if we use our serial console, we can watch as the boot process progresses to be fully started. So we're getting there. So we used, to create this image, we used a standard B1S, so a burstable 1 gig image. It's a small image, but if it's a small firewall, you don't really need much more. So yeah, you might want to check Netgate's documentation for the right size firewall for your application. Alright, so we're waiting patiently for that to boot up. And we know that once we're booted up, we'll see the GUI come back. And now we're back into the interface, and now we want to make an assignment to the LAN interface. So we've now got an available interface here, and we just need to click the add button and hit save, and then go in and tell it that we want to enable this interface, but we also want it to be sourcing its IP address from Azure using DHCP. So that will be all that we need to do to get us running. Now it's got an option here to block bogan networks. Okay, it's saying this option should only be used on external interfaces, so we don't need it here. We can apply it there. We might just go to our WAN interface, and let's see if it's already done. So it's already pre-configured. So we've now, if we have a look at our status and interfaces, we've now got our LAN interface, it's up, and it's got its IP address from Azure. So if we look in the firewall rules now, we can see the wisdom of adding our own anti-lockout rule, because now we've got the LAN interface, it's moved the anti-lockout rule to the LAN interface. It expects you to connect to the firewall from the safe side. So this rule here is just allowing us to continue accessing it from the internet. Okay, so now what more do we need to do? Well, in our backend subnet, so we'll just go up to our overview here, and this is a testing VM. So I've got this testing VM installed. Let's just refresh. And I'll just go back. I think we've Okay, so we've got the testing VM, but I just seem to notice that it doesn't appear. Let's add one. So this testing VM doesn't have a public IP address, so I'm just going to add that for myself. So I'm going to go network interface, and I'm going to go IP configurations, and just add an IP, and there it is. So it was added in the past. Now the reason I'm doing this is so that I can show you the difference between routing through the pfSense and using the default having a public IP addressable on a VM. So we're just going to get our terminal up, and I'm just waiting for that to add. And once that completes, we just need to get right, so now should be added. Let's go find out what the public IP address is. Here it is in the back, and it should give us our, so we now have, so we've got our, let's find out what our current public IP address is for this Linux instance. So our Linux instance currently, I've got a public IP address attached to it, and that's how it's accessing the internet, straight out the public IP address. But we need to change it so it accesses the internet through our firewall. So now we're just going to go through that process of configuring the virtual network. If we have a look at our diagram, we can see that we're going to have to tell any host on this backend subnet to use a different route table. So when they're trying to access anything other than this local subnet, they'll need to go and talk to this LAN interface. So we want to now go into routes or route tables, hit the create button, and give the route table and go review and create again. And once that's deployed, we now need to create, and no, we need to go to our route table, refresh, and we need to now add a route. So the route name will be, so we're going to say the destination is, and this is this wildcard in CIDR format, so it's all IP addresses, and then we want to say we want to use the virtual appliance. Now if we need reminding of what the IP address is, so it's the LAN interface, so we just copy that in, we say okay. So for this backend subnet, we want, whenever they're trying to access anything other than the subnet, we want them to go through the virtual appliance. So as soon as that's added, we now need to associate this route table with the correct subnet. Now notice, once I go OK, notice that we've got, so currently, and then I've just pressed enter again, and we've just lost connectivity to our virtual machine. So it's now been told to, instead of route out its public IP address, it's saying route to the outside world using the pfSense. So we've now lost connectivity, and as you can see, it's disconnected. So now we want to get connected back to that virtual machine. Now that virtual machine, if we have a look in our VMs, we'll just get the IP address of it, and we can see it's got a public IP, but we're not interested in that. We're interested in the private IP. So I'm just going to scroll down until we see that. It's 10.87.1.4. So what we're going to do is we're going to use port forwarding to access it behind the pfSense. So at the moment, the automatic setup is that if you've set your interfaces right, they'll create automatic rules for the subnet behind. Now, if you've got multiple subnets, you'll definitely need to change to hybrid, and then you'll be able to add extra NAT rules to NAT the other subnets here. But we don't need to do that because we've only got one subnet and it's already been detected and created the correct rules. So now we want to hit port forward and just add a rule and say when something hits the WAN interface or traffic hits that and the destination address is the WAN address, and we'll do a custom port, so and the custom port is 5022, then I want you to redirect from that port to this host on the SSH port. So we now have our redirection. Test VM. Alright, so once that's done, we click apply, and it's created this rule, the NAT rule, but you can also go into your rules and see that it's also created an allow rule on our firewall. And this allow rule is allowing something after the translation's done. So the translation happens, so it redirects it from that port to this port and this host, and then it says, well, after that's done, it's still allowed to get through. So what we now want to do is connect not to the public IP address of the VM. We're going to connect to the pfSense on that custom port, and let's hope that we've done it right. And currently nothing's happening. Now there's a reason for that, and this is where you'll get stuck because you've got two levels of firewall that you're contending with, and that's the Network Security Group. So go into your pfSense VM, go to Network Settings, make sure that it's you using the WAN NIC, so the first NIC that we added, and then say, okay, well I'm trying to access port 5022, so I need to create a rule to allow that. And every now and then this goes a bit funny. Sometimes you've got to wrestle with that because the JavaScript makes it hard, but now just say, yep, anyone can access 52022 and okay that. And now in theory, if we wait a few moments, it should allow us to connect any moment. Now, why wouldn't it connect now? We've added a firewall rule. Well, there's another issue that we haven't fixed as well. So that's issue 1, add a allow rule for whichever port is coming in. Issue 2, we need to go into the network interface, the WAN interface, go into IP configurations, and then we have this enable IP forwarding. So this says it allows the virtual machine on this network interface to act as a router and receive traffic addressed to other destinations. Well, the traffic certainly is destined for somewhere else, and it needs to have this enable IP forwarding on not the WAN interface. That's actually incorrect. We're going to have to go back. We want it to be the LAN interface. So let's select the correct one and go in and enable it. Now, once you just enable that, just click apply, and that may be all we need now in order to get connected. So let's try that one more time. And have we got there yet? Let me go check the interfaces and see if I've got, oh actually it's this one here. I think I've got an incorrect IP address. That's interesting, isn't it? So all that time things weren't working for a different reason, but I'm showing you incorrectly. But trust me on this, those two changes that we made were absolutely vital, and if I had have had the right IP address in there, the same connection timeout would have happened. So now we can go back to our command to find out what our external IP address is and just paste that in, and we can now see that the testing VM is no longer using its public IP address. It's now routing everything through to the internet using the pfSense firewall name. So that now gives us what we need, and if we have a look, we've got internet access out to the internet, but of course through the pfSense firewall. So now we can go into our pfSense firewall and do things like look at our system logs, check for denied traffic in the firewall section. We can start to create VPN tunnels inbound to give access to our Azure services. We can tweak our firewall rules so that it's not just explicitly allow for everybody. We can disable IP6 if we want to on our interfaces, so we can say, okay, I don't really want this to be an IP6 capable firewall, so I'll just disable that traffic completely. And the same with LAN, we've already disabled it. So we can now start to do everything we need to do with our pfSense firewall to make it a robust solution to protect our resources in Azure. So I hope this video has been helpful to someone.